And I have the honor and distinct privilege of presiding over the departments that maintain the archival manuscript and rare book collections here at Western Library. So I have a really great job. And there are 3 departments that report within the context of heritage resources, and those are the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies, the University Archives, which are both housed in this building, and then the campus special collections, which is housed in Wilson Library up on the main campus. We also share the building with the Northwest Regional Branch of the State Archives. They've been wonderful partners to us and to our researchers over the years. So very special place that you're in right now in terms of folks that are interested in doing research in regional studies. So how many of you have been here before? Oh, good. And we've got some new folks as well. You're here on this cold, wonderful winter day for the second presentation in a new speaker series launched by Heritage Resources just this year. Over the course of the academic year through May, we're going to have 6 speakers talk about topics for which they've done extensive research in one or more of the Heritage Resources collections. So the speakers all focus on some aspect of exciting research utilizing our collections. I won't go into each of the upcoming programs, but we do have some flyers, I think some yellow sheets out there on the table when you came in, and we'll certainly be publicizing the upcoming talks over through media, local media, as well as on our website. So stay tuned for that. We hope to have you back here soon. They alternate between the library and the archives building. So today's speaker, Helen Morgan Parmett, is also this year's awardee for our James W. Scott Research Fellowship Award. This is an award that we offer each year. It's an endowment in honor of the late Jim Scott. Some of you may remember Jim. He was a longtime faculty chair in the geography department and the regional planning department. And he was also the founder of the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies and its first director as well. Jim was really responsible for doing some groundbreaking work in the community in terms of identifying some key collections, some key resources both in Bellingham and in the region that form the core of the collections here at the center, so the core research materials that our fellows and others are using in support of this speaker series. I'm really thrilled that Jim's wife, Barta, was able to join us today, sit here in the front row. Barta has been a longtime supporter of the endowment associated with this fellowship and also the work that we do at the center. So thanks very much for being here today. Again, this fellowship supports studies, interdisciplinary studies, regional studies, specifically using collections in the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies. And so it's cutting edge research, significant research, and you'll learn that today through the work that Helen is doing. We rely on the endowment, but we also rely on contributions from folks like you to support these fellowships. So if you have an interest and an ability to provide support for the fellowship, either talk to me after the presentation or to Ruth, who's opening the door over there. Just catch one of us and we'd be happy to connect you with the foundation and tell you a little bit more about that opportunity. So without further ado, I'm really delighted to introduce and welcome Dr. Helen Morgan Parmett. Helen is an assistant professor in Western's Department of Communication Studies, where she teaches courses in media studies, critical media literacy, advocacy through media, and communications theory. She and her students are regular visitors to the archives, and it's always a pleasure to have her classes here. Very enthusiastic learners, and I think indicative of a very good teacher. Her current research looks at media culture in the Pacific Northwest, with particular emphasis on the relationship between Bellingham's media culture and regional geography, especially as it relates to racial identity formation. So really ideal for the kind of work that we like to promote and produce through the Scott Fellowship. Helen is a member of the Pacific Northwest Media Research Consortium, and her work has appeared in journals such as Communication, Culture and Critique, Television and New Media, and Mediascape. Helen's presentation draws extensively on research that she's done in the Rogan Jones collection, as well as the KVOS materials here at the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies. Her presentation today will focus on the role of KVOS radio and television stations in forging a sense of local Bellingham identity and culture. The title of her presentation this afternoon is KVOS in the Local and Public Interest. And welcome, Helen. It's wonderful to have you here.
Hi, Hey, thank you all so much for coming. I'm just overjoyed to see so many of you and to get to share this research with you. I want to say thank you especially to the staff from the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies, who's been incredibly generous and just supportive of my research here and have really just been amazing people to get to know and to work with. Thanks especially to Ruth Steele, Rosalind Kester, Eric Master, and of course Elizabeth Jofrian. I also want to thank so much the Scott family for their generous support of the James W. Scott Fellowship. There's really nothing better than earning a little bit of money for something that you absolutely love doing and probably would have done anyway. So I'm so thankful for their generous support of this research. I also want to thank the Communication Studies Department, participants at a former conference that I went to, the Society of Cinema and Media Studies, Mary Erickson, as well as Suzanne Blaze, who I see in the back here, I shared sort of early thoughts about this research, and they provide really helpful feedback and set the stage for me sort of developing some of these ideas. So thank you so much for that. And I'm just really grateful for having done the research. I got to finally listen to Rogan Jones's voice for the first time on an old reel-to-reel tape that Roz generously set up for me, which was quite a contraption of this like German piece of technology that who knows how it works, but she knew how it worked, which was amazing. And I heard this voice that I had like read all of this stuff about, and I had been reading these letters that he had written in the 1930s and the 1950s, and to finally sort of hear his voice coming through was it was a really like phenomenal experience. So it's been really wonderful to do this research. So with that said, I want to get started and just note that in today's era of conglomerated and convergent media, where about 6 transnational media companies own and control the majority of what we see, hear, and listen to, advocates and scholars are returning to the idea of local and community media. So here in Bellingham, media reform advocates actually recently won a pretty great victory by getting the city council to concede that the public was due a public access TV station to air local content. Now, though the decision was steeped in a debate over the relevance of television in today's digital mediascape, what seemed to emerge without question was a clear notion that communities need their own media outlets where they can share stories, debate pressing issues in the community, and indeed struggle over precisely who the community is and what the community stands for. As Marty Derlin and Kathy Melio argue in their work on the grassroots radio movement in the United States, quote, people bring issues to our airwaves that are often misrepresented, if represented at all, by other media. Listeners can be educated, uplifted, activated, enlightened, frustrated, surprised, and empowered by community media, which become lifelines in their communities. So the recent interest in local community media actually has a much longer history, as broadcasting from the very beginning was bound up with a policy of localism. Early radio legislation, including the 1927 Radio Act and the Communication Act of 1934, divided up the nation into geographic zones for the purposes of dividing up radio frequencies and licensing frequencies, mandating that entrusting the public airwaves to commercial and corporate control would require operators to work in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. These policies required station operators in each zone to serve not just a national, sort of broader national public interest, but to serve their local communities as well. As media scholar Douglas Gomery notes, quote, while network economics pressured a national system, policymakers were positioning stations and local communities and asking owners, managers, and programmers to direct their efforts to their community. Now, we might say that the need for community media here in Bellingham feels especially poignant because of the loss of KVOS. Bellingham's first radio and TV station was for a long time locally owned and operated, and even when it was eventually sold to a larger conglomerate, it continued to air local public affairs content as well as provide studio space for the community for many years. KVOS recently closed up its Bellingham operation over on Ellis Street and moved to Seattle, where it now airs mostly 1950s network TV shows under the MeTV corporate brand. Now, though I by no means wish to argue that KVOS was Bellingham's sole community media outlet, it's clear to me, even after living here for only 2.5 years, that KVOS played a really special role in Bellingham and Bellingham community. KVOS took shape during a key time in which most of broadcasting's basic definitions, functions, and uses were struggled over and set into motion. Rogan Jones, who originally owned KVOS and considered himself a radio and TV pioneer, would come to play a significant role in this history, locally, nationally, and even internationally. Yet the history of Jones and KVOS has received little to no attention in radio and television scholarship. During Jones's ownership, KVOS won a landmark case in 1937 against the Associated Press that allowed radio stations to read news over the air. It would build one of the first CCTV cable infrastructures and operated one of the first TV licenses in a city of Bellingham's size. And it was one of the first TV stations to actively seek out cross-border and international programming. KVOS thus helped to illustrate how local station operators and listeners in a small city on an international border negotiated broadcasting policy mandates to serve the local public interest, and in so doing, helped to contribute to how those broader policies would be defined and carried out as well. Given the changing dynamics of today's global and conglomerated media industry and the drive of local communities to develop community media systems, I believe we have much to learn from returning to the history of KVOS. Media history helps to provide answers as to how we got here, as well as insights into the fissures, debates, and paths not taken that can help to inform decision-making related to democratizing the media system in the present and future. In what follows, I draw from archival research that I conducted here at the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies, where I've worked extensively with the Rogan Jones and KVOS collections, examining thousands, literally thousands of documents over the time period between 1930 to 1960. I'm especially interested in the cultural history of the station, or in other words, in how local radio and later television responded to a variety of cultural shifts, formations, and struggles that took shape concurrently with the rise of KVOS, and how the station helped to mediate those shifts back to its listeners. With this in mind in my presentation today, I attend particularly to the role of KVOS in constituting a local Bellingham identity and the ways in which this identity helped listeners and viewers to negotiate broader regional, national, and international identities that were being formed at the time. I first discussed significant aspects in the history of KVOS radio and then turned to the role of early KVOS TV broadcasting. I suggest KVOS's radio history illuminates how the station and listeners made sense of the localism mandate and negotiated Bellingham's identity in relation to the Pacific Northwest region and the nation in the wake of demographic shifts from the rural to the urban, increasing influxes of immigration, and class antagonisms. Whereas KVOS's radio history illustrates how Bellingham's local identity was inflected by discourses of the urban and the nation, KVOS TV's history demonstrates the significance of Bellingham's location on an international border and the role television played in constituting a sense of international cosmopolitan identity and citizenship in Bellingham and the broader Pacific Northwest region. I attend especially to the roles played by media policy, KVOS programming, and audience reception of that programming, and how each helped to shape who we are as Bellinghamsters and how we might see ourselves in the future. So although there are numerous anecdotes, programming decisions, and internal KVOS politics that I could relate from my research in the early days of KVOS radio, I want to highlight some of the most significant events that shaped how I think KVOS would define programming in the local interest, and consequently helped constitute a sense of local identity. These include the Associated Press's 1934 to 1936 Supreme Court case against KVOS, and the latter's consequent right to read news over the air, KVOS's contentious 1936 licensing case, in which they almost lost their radio license because of the examiner's contention that they did not serve the local public interest, and their incorporation of network programming from the Don Lee Mutual Network in 1937, and the letter writing contest that they held to see how listeners felt about the switch to being on a national network. And then I also highlight some of the local programming that followed the switch in the 1940s. So KVOS was actually originally owned by Frank Seifert, the general manager of the local newspaper, the Bellingham Herald. And it was common at the time for newspapers to own radio stations, but many of these early news-owned radio stations, including KVOS, failed to turn a profit and were subsequently sold. So Rogan Jones, who was a businessman living in Aberdeen, Washington, who also owned a successful radio station there, KPQ, acquired KVOS in Bellingham in April 1929 from Seifert. Jones owned the local radio station, which later became KGMI, up until his death in 1972. Whereas some views of early radio understood the medium as an extension of theater, vaudeville, or film, Jones saw radio primarily as a vehicle for news rather than entertainment. In a September 1946 internal memo to KVOS employees, Jones argued, quote, "Radio is but a projection of newspaper work, which goes back to the old town crier, the ancient traveling bards, and all other early forms of dissemination of entertainment, information, intelligence about people and the things that happen to people." Yet, not everyone saw radio in this way, as Rogan's views, along with the station's penchant for reading news, sometimes straight from a variety of local and regional newspapers over the air, resulted in a lawsuit that eventually made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. Although it was primarily the Bellingham Herald and to a lesser extent the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and the Seattle Daily Times that took issue with KVOS reading their news over the radio on the program Newspaper of the Air because it cost them newspaper sales and advertising sponsors, it was the Associated Press, or the AP, who ultimately pressed charges against KVOS in 1934. The AP accused KVOS of pirating news from the Herald and others, and consequently violating newspapers' property rights and creating unfair competition, thereby harming the competitiveness of the AP, since they were the ones providing a lot of that news to those papers. While the lower courts found for KVOS, the appeals court found for the AP on the basis that ensuring the profitability and competitiveness of newspapers was in the public interest. Now, this finding set the stage for the Supreme Court case, which Jones hoped to win by proving that news over the radio served the public interest better than the newspapers. KVOS argued that once papers had published news, then it belonged to the public. Thus, delivering it instantaneously over the air served the public interest, and because it was more convenient, they were able to get it instantaneously. As Jones claimed in his affidavit, quote, we get the news out in a more convenient way than having to buy the paper yourself. In L.H. Darwin's affidavit, and Darwin was the voice behind Newspaper of the Air, he claimed that the public interest that the program served especially was for people in Bellingham's rural outskirts, many of whom he claimed were, quote, unable to subscribe to and pay for a newspaper containing news, which is a day from the time of Affiant's radio broadcast. Now, this suggests that KVOS envisioned its news as bridging rural and urban listeners in the region, helping to constitute a sense of local public interest and identity that reached beyond the boundaries of Bellingham. Further, Darwin's and Jones's affidavit suggested KVOS was in a better position to serve the local public interest than the AP and the local papers because of radio's space and time collapsing qualities that enabled it to inform and educate the local community efficiently and simultaneously. Although KVOS ultimately won the Supreme Court case on a technicality in 1936 because the Supreme Court found that the AP had no standing because the damage was less than $3,000. But the case nevertheless resulted in the ability for all radio stations nationally to broadcast the news, which was a pretty landmark decision. During and after the AP case, KVOS and the Bellingham Herald exchanged a variety of incendiary comments about the other in each of their local media outlets. And here's an example of one. So in one instance, Frank Seifert, general manager of the Bellingham Publishing Company, replied to Rogan's letter demanding that the Herald retract their statements by telling Rogan that he should, quote, take his rat shop, strike breakers in your howler, walk down to the beach, and jump in the sea, signing off with a, yours hopefully, Frank I. Seifert. And in a subsequent letter, later that day, he informed Rogan that he should take his lawyer, Pemberton, with him. So in 1937, that's my favorite part of everything that I read. I probably didn't need to include it, but it was just so hilarious that I burst out laughing that I had to include it. So in 1937, KVOS sued the Bellingham Publishing Company for libel, citing in particular the Herald's piece following the AP case that claimed KVOS did not win the case on its merits and continued to pirate the news. The Herald in this article called KVOS a, quote, local radio outlaw, occupying a field unto itself, so different from the average station that it has a unique classification in the world of radio, and that it, quote, ought to be deleted or reformed as a service to this community and as a means of purifying radio. Nevertheless, KVOS would continue to remain committed to news as a primary means of serving the local public interest, and the AP case set up KVOS as an alternative news source in Bellingham to the Herald and the Seattle papers, providing in large part a news outlet favorable to Roosevelt's policies at the time, whereas the Herald was virulently anti-New Deal. Now, though this opened up forms of public debate in the city, the station perhaps remained more open to some than others. And indeed, this factor became crucial in the 1936 evaluation of KVOS's license renewal, in which the FCC examiner's report found the station was potentially in violation of the 1934 Communications Act because it failed to give equal opportunities to political candidates from opposing sides. Going further, however, the examiner took issue with whether or not the station's presentation of the news worked in the public interest because it took sides on controversial issues in the community. Several excerpts from broadcasts were given as examples of Newspaper on the Air and the announcer L.H. Darwin's controversial comments, which were said to create political discord in the community, such as Darwin's critique of the Herald and the mayoral candidate that Seifert and the Herald supported in 1935, where he claimed that they were laying plans to, quote, take control of this city away from the disciples of the hated Roosevelt and the believers in democratic doctrines and restore them to big business, acting through Seifert and his banker candidate for mayor. These statements suggest that Darwin's political fervor offended the sensibilities of the FCC. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, condemned this station for giving, quote, voice to ill feeling and antagonism between individuals and groups in the community served by the station. The report claimed Darwin's editorial comments failed to serve the public interest because they incited antagonism and political discord. This suggests that serving the public interest in the FCC standard would require stations to stay neutral and create a sense of community and national cohesion, as opposed to airing public grievances, political opinions, and the like. Rogan eventually asked Darwin to leave, and it was only after KVOS could prove that Darwin would no longer be a part of the programming that the FCC finally found in favor of KVOS's license renewal. Now, this shift in understanding local radio as less of a public sphere, i.e. a space for political discussion, debate, discord, controversy, and more of an informative, educational, and perhaps entertaining medium that eschewed local politics, was influenced by significant cultural shifts at the time related to advertising, mass culture, and the formation of a new sense of national identity that envisioned radio as a nation-building medium with the tasks of cultural uplift and improvement. The FCC licensing case against KVOS thus set the stage for cultivating radio in Bellingham as a medium bound up with the production of a new, modern sense of national identity that found favor in the nation's fast-developing cities. This vision of radio gave preference to the standards set by radio's network programming, developed in the nation's urban centers in New York, LA, and Chicago, over those created in the far-flung areas of most of the nation's many local stations. This shift to the centralizing forces of the networks helped to curb what the FCC saw as the dangers of fledgling local stations by creating sanctioned national culture that glossed over the rough edges of local or regional difference. In my view, these kind of modernizing ideas of radio can be seen in these 1940s radio advertisements that were kept by Rogan Jones in his collection. Yet the turn to what would become ubiquitous national programming did not do away with local stations, who continued to program local content along with that of the national networks. And these stations were still left to untangle what network programming would mean in terms of the local public interest. So too, listeners were left to decipher how their own sense of local, community, and regional identity fit into the broader national identity and culture depicted in the network programming. As numerous scholars have argued, radio, and the radio networks in particular, helped to construct what Benedict Anderson has referred to as the imagined community of the nation. Radio historian Susan Douglas notes radio enhanced listeners' abilities to, quote, imagine their fellow citizens, as well as their ability to be transported to national events and to other parts of the country. In the advent of network programming, tens of thousands of listeners tuned in at the same time to listen to the same programming, creating a sense of shared experience. Thus, as radio historian Michelle Hilmes argues, radio, quote, more than any other medium, seemed in its early days to lend itself to association with ideas of nation, of national identity, to the heart and mind of America, its soul. Yet this so-called universal national culture was also marked by deep rifts. Radio was posed in the 30s and 40s as both a source of and a solution to the antagonisms, struggles, and anxieties born out of the changing social, political, and economic climate of the time, including shifts in discourses of race and ethnicity in the wake of new waves of immigration, new class antagonisms and labor disputes emerging from experiences during the Great Depression, the rise of mass culture, changing gender norms and relations between the public and the private, and spatial shifts related to urbanization and industrialization. We like to think of our time today as like, oh my God, things are changing so much, but in the 20s and 30s, the turn of the century, this is really, fundamental shifts that changed so many things about the way that people understood themselves and the world around them. So far from creating a universal national culture, networked radio programming instead created a sense of American national identity from the perspective of its primarily white, Northern European, urban, and middle and upper class producers and owners. These representations, images, and values worked as a strategy to contain the growing differences burgeoning from, quote, the tidal wave of otherness sweeping onto the American shores between 1890 and 1921 that produced a growing tension between us and other and evoked questions about what did true American identity consist of, and which groups held true values. These forces and antagonisms came to the fore in Bellingham in 1907 when a riot erupted in which white workers moved viciously through town, beating and eventually driving out entirely the South Asian Sikh workers who had come to the Pacific Northwest and migrated to Bellingham to seek work in the lumber industry. Yet radio did not only produce a dominant and normative national identity, it also enabled listeners to experience at the same time multiple identities: national, regional, local, some of them completely allied with the country's prevailing cultural and political ideologies, others of them suspicious or at odds with official culture. Now, each of these tensions, anxieties, and antagonisms are thrown into sharp relief in the archival records related to KVOS's sign-on to the Don Lee Mutual Broadcasting Network, particularly in the letters that remain from a contest that invited listeners to write in about their favorite KVOS program and how they felt about the new network hookup. And these kinds of records, that the fact that the station saved records of all the people who wrote into a letter writing contest is like really phenomenal. And for a sort of historical researcher, that was like I found a pot of gold. So particularly significant for Bellingham's switch to the network, as for most stations, is the way in which it required listeners to evaluate their own identities and communities in terms of how they fit into a social hierarchy of place that put urban production centers squarely in the center of what was considered official, respectable, and distinguished national culture. The letters that remain from the contest illustrate how listeners negotiated tensions and shifts from local to national and network, and how they addressed the consequent new rifts between the urban and the rural, particularly because Bellingham was not quite either. Listener letters show clearly that network programs did not create a homogeneous national identity, but rather were negotiated by listeners who used radio to make sense of their everyday lives, local community, and identities in the wake of these widespread national shifts. For those that supported the move to the network, one overarching discourse marked their thinking. Listeners suggested KVOS moving to the network would, quote, put Bellingham on the map, and was thus a mark of progress and more quality programming. As Mrs. Gertrude Arrington from Bellingham put it, quote, you are not only helping yourself when you have made the improvement on KVOS, but have helped to put Bellingham on the map as an up-to-date station. Listeners suggested putting Bellingham on the map meant that Bellingham as a whole would become more modernized through their exposure to network programming. This sentiment pervaded other letters as well that characterized putting Bellingham on the map as a mark of progress. According to Mrs. Lillian Rice, this progress was necessary if Bellingham was going to maintain its competitiveness with other cities of progress. She notes, quote, I think the Don Lee hookup is great. One more step on the ladder of progress for Bellingham has been made. Why? It puts Bellingham in the red letter on the map. To be progressive, we must keep up with other cities of progress. Similarly, Monterey Thayer argued for the necessity of competing favorably against other states in the growing Northwest region, suggesting, quote, to grow in prosperity, we must unite with larger networks so that we can progress with time and keep up with our neighboring states. How would hooking up with a network enable the city to progress and keep up with its neighbors and other growing cities? For some, the idea was that network programming would help to construct a place identity for Bellingham as modern, and therefore could help attract tourists and investors. Gertrude Arrington again argued, quote, businessmen and women and tourists will be more willing to look at the town of Bellingham overseeing the change. The businessman as a promising place for business, the tourist as something worthwhile, also bringing in more trade to our local stores and making this town a more promising one. This sense that the network would help Bellingham progress was not only characterized as significant for putting Bellingham on the map for outsiders, but it was also characterized as a means of progress and cultural uplift of the local citizenry as well. This sentiment was expressed by listeners who saw the network programs as being a higher quality, and consequently as bringing in new, modern, cosmopolitan, and progressive ideas and practices. One listener expressed, quote, our news items are better than ever. The variety of programs from other stations certainly gave real entertainment and a broader knowledge of what the rest of the world is doing. The educational programs give newer ideas and teach us many things about the care of our home, children, and schools. These things are essential. Another listener, Kathleen Kesey, made explicit that the move to the network was a move away from a sense of localism, one she saw as a move for the better, stating, quote, so at last, KVOS has dropped the cloak of localism and has actually broken down and joined the network. I've always wondered how long it would take the station to become progressive and leap up into bigger and better things. Go up the ladder a notch or two. Just think, on our own station, the world's finest entertainers will perform in person. Football games right from the fields. I'm pleased and proud of this movement. Time marches on, and KVOS no longer lags behind. This listener does explicitly what other letter writers did implicitly, mark a clear oppositional distinction between localism and network nationalism or centralism, setting up a hierarchical dualism between the two. As media historian Bill Kirkpatrick argues, discourses of localism in the 20s and 30s tended to be used pejoratively. Local was counterposed to the urban, to the city man, and thus local broadcasting was projected as primitive, provincial, irrational, ignorant, and bigoted, as opposed to modern, cosmopolitan, rational, open-minded, and tolerant. This construction of geographic hierarchies, whereas one geography appeared to determine one's class, identity, tastes, and value systems, was made especially clear in a letter from a listener who had moved to Bellingham from a big city. Mrs. F.A. Wright wrote, quote, "I came here to Bellingham from one of the big cities of our fair USA, and after waiting and listening patiently, I finally realized your station was a little hometown office. I was truly disappointed. Such a lovely little town with such a station. I being accustomed to a quiet Sunday listening to the concerts, this seemed a letdown. You can just imagine my broad smile when you just announced that you were to hook up with the Don Lee Mutual Broadcasting Corporation. Yes, I am truly glad." These discourses of progress suggest some listeners believe that the localism of the station's programming, in effect, those aspects of the city's culture that were bound up with the city's pioneering history, were a threat to the city's progress and ability to compete. National network programming and the national identities and cultures it promised were seen as solutions to filing down the city's rough rural edges and ushering it into a modern industrial moment, positing an excess of localism in rural America as a kind of disease for which national radio provided the cure. But in the 20s and 30s, Bellingham was neither particularly urban nor particularly rural. It was actually the 5th largest city in the state of Washington based on population size, no longer even ranks in the top 10. Despite being a relatively larger city in the state, the city still had a kind of pioneering identity that associated more with a provincial ruralism than a modern cosmopolitan urban center. But at the time, listeners seemed to express hope at the potential for modernizing the city, and they saw networked radio's ability to bring in ideas and voices from the newly rising urban centers of radio production as a means for doing so. But not all listeners preferred the network programming, and a number of listeners eschewed discourses of national identity and modern progress in favor of local difference. For many listeners, KVOS's local programming was expressed as just as good as the national networks, suggesting listeners resisted the ideologies rooted in the distinctions between national urban versus local rural. For example, Mrs. A.J. McLaren of Bellingham argued, quote, "I like the Don Lee programs fine, but the others were just as good." Another listener wrote, quote, "Your station has always been our family's favorite on the dial, but today I fear it has lost its identity. However, I suppose there are advantages in the new hookup, but what are they? A bigger variety? We can always get that. Bellingham talent is unlimited, and we should endeavor to give it a wider scope on the ether. After listening to foreign voices, I find our announcers are second to none. I know KVOS is a home-loving institution and hope it won't go too far astray and long for its return to the fold. I love my local station." These letters suggest some listeners feared the station, and perhaps, by extension, Bellingham, risked losing its identity in the national switch. Other listeners recognized some positive aspect to the programs on the networks that they enjoyed, but bade KVOS to be sure not to lose that hometown touch. As Henry Bienshenvi, one of the only men to write into the contest, wrote, quote, "Please, with all the wonderful network programs, don't let KVOS lose that hometown touch. You know what I mean, the good old local programs we learned to enjoy." For at least one listener, one of the aspects of the hometown touch that was at risk of being lost was the station's commitment to political debate, class politics, and the New Deal. Ella N. Kerr of South Bellingham wrote, quote, "We liked the way Mr. L.H. Darwin stood on his own feet and fought for you and for the New Deal and the common people. And we'll say that we are more than sorry that you broke your contract with him, for we feel that the station is far from being New Deal today." These differences in opinion over the value of national versus local identity and culture played out not only in debates over the quality of programming, but also debates over the quality of voice. This sentiment could be read in many listeners who responded with references to the quality of a radio announcer's voice as a key determinant of whether they liked a particular program rather than its content. And they often linked this to the quality of the network or the quality of the local station as a whole. For example, one listener who liked the local programs wrote, quote, "You have some good speakers on the air, one very good. He has the voice everyone listens to. You're for a good radio station in the old hometown." Another listener favoring the network wrote, quote, "It couldn't be KVOS, a new voice, pleasant, friendly, clear. What had happened?" When the news came, it was given in a clear, understandable way. Words were properly announced and communicated. This man could read. I can't tell you what a pleasure and surprise it is to us. Now, these letters speak to an important aspect of radio and its role in producing and maintaining cultural and collective identities, the voice. The aesthetics of voice became a point of contention over assimilating into a broader national culture and identity marked by clear, articulate speech, or preserving the rough-edged speech engendered by Bellingham's particular history and mix of differing immigrant and native cultures. As Susan Douglas notes, the aesthetics of voice and listening are central to radio culture, quote, because the act of listening simultaneously to spoken words forms hearers into a group. People listening to a common voice at the same time become an aggregate entity, an audience. And whether or not they all agree with or like what they hear, they're unified around that common experience. We're actually feeling similar sensations in our bodies at exactly the same time when we listen as a group. In part, this is because of a physical response. Listening often imparts a sense of emotion stronger than imparted by looking. But again, whether this sense of collective identity would be one of centralized national listening public or diversity of listeners from distinct subcultures, localities, and so forth, would be a point of contention in the very nature of the radio voice itself. Douglas contends that, quote, by the mid-1930s, with the highly commercialized network system in place, a great majority of these voices, which sought to sound familiar, intimate, even folksy, represented a centralized consumer culture. Thus, KVOS's listeners' differences in affective responses to voice suggest differing perspectives on one's identity in relation to place and national culture. In all, the differing perspectives in the letters from the contest suggest that listeners did not passively accept the switch to network programming, but actively interpreted and negotiated what that would mean for their own sense of place and identity. While some supported the dominant discourses of national progress, cultural uplift, and urbanization of the rural, others resisted these discourses and proposed alternative discourses that reclaimed the value of local and regional differences. Indeed, the winning programs that listeners liked the most were a mix of local and network programming, and the winning program itself, News, was a mixture of local and national programming as well. 6 of the top 13 winners were local programs, as you can see up here, and maybe you recognize some of these network programs or even the local programs. This suggests that rather than shedding local identity for a cohesive national identity, listeners instead constructed a new and potentially at times contradictory hybrid identity that incorporated both national and local, the rural and the urban. Yet it's important to note that the station's role in producing national and local identities was still marked by other forms of exclusion, particularly those related to racial and ethnic differences. There are woefully few references to race and ethnicity in the files. This is perhaps surprising given what must have clearly been a tense racial climate following the 1907 riots and the ongoing racial and ethnic struggles in the Pacific Northwest at the time over South Asian immigration. This suggests that although KVOS's local and network programming provided a vehicle for listeners to navigate new senses of identity and difference, they were nonetheless hailed into a unified listening public that addressed listeners as white and Western European. In so doing, KVOS's network and local programming stitched Bellingham into the larger national discourse that posed local identity in opposition to the foreign and racialized immigrant other. But as KVOS's programming schedule shows, the station maintained a mix of local and network programming through the 1940s. Some programming catered especially to rural identity, such as the Farmers Listening program that aired each morning from 6 to 6:30 and promised listeners they would learn about methods of scientific farming, tips for the farmer, a question and answer department, farm news, and an international news service and music selections. Even this description points to the tensions between rural, provincial, and urban industrial, such as the reference to scientific methods of farming or international news versus the question and answer period regarding local farming issues. Another example of this kind of programming was the San Juan Island Salmon Derby special, whose transcripts balanced between extolling the values of Northwest fishing history, pioneering identities, Native American culture, and a kind of urbanizing gaze that constructed the event as a local oddity and a quirky and isolated community. Other programs like the Walls Theater Quiz, a popular audience participation program, served as advertisement for local businesses and also helped to constitute a sense of collective consumer identity bound up to the nation's emerging consumer culture and its local manifestations. Few local programs in the 40s addressed Bellingham in terms of internal differences, instead positing the city as a kind of cohesive space both distinct from and shaped by the broader national culture. The only radio program I was able to find that addressed a distinct cultural identity in Bellingham was the Scandinavian Music Hour. Surprisingly, little of the local programming addressed women as a specific audience, though many of the network programs did so. And this is especially surprising to me because women were the primary radio listening audience, not only of the networks, but also of KVOS, which was clearly demonstrated in the fact that 99.9% of the letters that were written in were by women. In 1952, KVOS sponsored another letter writing contest, this one called Count Bellingham's Blessings. In a statement announcing the program, Jones argued, quote, "Bellingham is one of the most delightful places in the world in which to live. Too often do we hear laments and woeful expressions of the shortcomings of this community. We hear such pessimism in our homes, our group meetings, and on the streets. My hometown should mean much to all of us. It should mean a better place to live, to work, to do business, and to raise a family. It should mean a place where we work together and live together for the good of us all. KVOS offered a $150 cash prize to the best letter on Why I Like Bellingham. Although the program might have worked as a form of civic boosterism, listeners were addressed not as outsiders, but as Bellingham residents, and they were invited to write into the station by communicating who Bellingham was and what that meant, what it valued, and why those values mattered. This seems particularly significant given the ways in which the city and the radio station had experienced such great upheavals in the 20s and 30s, destabilizing Bellingham's sense of place and identity in the wake of shifting regional, national, and transnational events. Unfortunately, in this case, only the winning letter was kept with the archival documents. As a result, we have only one particular viewpoint on these meanings, rather than the diverse and conflicting sentiments that listeners likely communicated. Nevertheless, the winning letter is quite telling about how Bellingham's place-based identity would have likely worked to navigate these potential conflicts and tensions over who a Bellinghamster was and what he or she valued, as the writer suggested that what was so great about Bellingham was that it, quote, struck the golden mean. As the winner wrote, quote, we have neither a boomtown with its accompanying juvenile problems, vices, and housing shortages, nor a static, sterile community where unemployment prevails. With our stable industries such as fishing, logging, pulp and paper mills, shipyards, and farming, we can offer diversified employment to individuals with varied interests. Having both the advantages of employment and small-town environment gives us unexcelled opportunities for excellent park and playground facilities, schools with adequate classrooms and teachers, and a minimum of crime and violence. It has been said that happiness can only come through the golden mean of stability, and stability is the keynote of Bellingham. Perhaps foreseeing that humorous but seemingly apt street art over on, I think it's Holly Street, but I'm not sure, that so eloquently seems to capture the soul of Bellingham as, quote, the city of subdued excitement, the listener honed in on a crucial aspect to how understanding Bellingham navigated and negotiated the increasing distinction between the local and national and the rural and the urban, and all the hierarchies, ideologies, and politics that would accompany those distinctions. It refused either of them. Instead, it accepted its place in between, a small city, what I've been calling in my research a peripheral city, close to major urban centers, but far enough not to be subsumed by them and all of their attendant fearful discourses associating the urban with race, blackness, crime, but also urban enough to dissociate Bellingham from rural provincialism and all of the ideological bigotry that was accorded to those spaces. In so doing, keeping in mind that this was 1952, Bellingham managed to project a place identity that appeared to remain outside of and apart from the growing racial strife that was beginning to turn from the more subtle microaggressions of daily life to the physical manifestations of a boiling race war, protesting centuries of racial injustice and violence. I want to linger here just for a moment, particularly in light of the current events that are happening in Ferguson, as well as in light of the 1907 riots and the hundreds of South Asians brutally beaten and excluded from our city, the substantial number of migrant farm workers living in our neighborhoods, many of whom face persecution and threats of violence, not to mention rarely make a living wage, and the fact that white Europeans will no doubt be the minority in the state of Washington in as little as 10 years. Although there is no doubt value to counting Bellingham's blessings as an in-between golden mean, neither rural nor urban, there's also a real danger here. And that danger lies in imagining, especially, that the injustices that come from racism and other forms of exclusion and denigration of othered bodies is not something that happens here. It risks homogenizing Bellingham into a coherent, uncontested place when it is anything but. Although my abstract today professed to identify the meaning of Bellingham's identity, what I'm hoping to emphasize now and in the rest of the presentation is that Bellingham's identity is neither singular nor unified, but rather is one that's marked by divisions, diversity, and even antagonisms. And maybe the history of KVOS can help us to recognize some of these fractures, perhaps even recognize the potential in local media for helping to publicize and bring to the forefront those fractures. Not so that we can dismiss them or subsume them back into some coherent identity, but rather so that we might understand, value, and appreciate those differences and begin to work towards avenues of justice together. But I want to turn now from the history of the radio, KVOS radio, to KVOS TV, which helps to illuminate yet another inflection of Bellingham's diverse and sort of uncoherent identity, the regional and transnational. Now, it's well known that the technology to produce television and even the idea of a kind of distant sight existed long before it was put into practice and became a fixture of the 1950s suburban home. In KVOS records, it appears that Rogan Jones was considering TV at least as early as 1936. But it was not until the early 1950s when TV emerged as a real possibility for Bellingham and KVOS. Like radio, local TV stations were largely left to themselves to define how it was that this new technology would serve the local public interest. In the early 1950s, the FCC pushed the idea of local television. In the early 1950s, the FCC pushed the idea of local television. For example, in the Commission's sixth report and order in 1952, the Commission made local programming a paramount policy goal, seeking to, quote, push the new medium to develop live local programming and calling for programs of local interests, activities, and talents. Yet, as media geographer Michael Curtin notes, the Commission never elaborated much beyond referring to local stations as the mouthpiece of the community. And even internal FCC memos suggest that the Commission struggled to define the boundaries of community and how TV would attend to differences between inside and outside. This is in part due to the materiality of broadcasting signals, which have the potential to reach far beyond the communities in which they originate. Indeed, it was KVOS's signal range that would greatly influence how it would come to invent a new definition of local that spread into a new region and even a new nation, British Columbia, Canada. KVOS's entrance into television therefore once again changed the way in which Bellingham would be addressed, not only as both local and national citizens, but also as regional and international citizens as well. So too, this would influence the kinds of programming that KVOS TV would offer, now that the local community they served was represented as an international one that reached across national boundaries. Although it is clear that KVOS is thinking about TV very early on, the station tread cautiously on determining too early what form TV would take in the community and into what purpose it would be put. This disposition was illuminated in KVOS's early 1950s radio program, TV and You, that aired at 7:45 p.m. Tuesday and Sunday evenings to both educate and inform listeners about TV and to query what it might mean for them. In the opening broadcast on December 10, 1950, Rogan told listeners that the program was initiated, quote, for the purpose of keeping listeners in this area informed about radio's most exciting development, television. By the time KVOS had already made engineering history by becoming one of the first stations in the nation to utilize a self-built antenna and cable system to hook up local Bellingham households to tap into the King TV feed out of Seattle. Many of the early TV and U broadcasts described the cable system, where it was connected, and invited listeners to comment upon how it was working for them. The homemade cable system included an antenna located at 25th and Knox Street, a cable amplifying antenna, and boosters and amplifiers every 2,000 feet, delivering service to downtown and Southside Bellingham. Until the engineer, Ernie Harper, created a new antenna with an automatic volume control, a high school student would actually manually adjust the volume of the amplifier at the antenna each night, which I found pretty phenomenal. Jones claims that the system was the second invented and only one of five in the nation, though there are other cities that make the same claim. Regardless of exactness, it's clear that KVOS TV was a pioneer. KVOS invited residents in to come into the station to see if their house would receive reception, stating that, quote, on the lobby wall is a large city map showing you where the cable now is and where it could be. Look at the map and see if you're on the cable. The system was, as Jones conceded, imperfect. Quote, a few people in scattered areas get pretty good pictures most of the time. But KVOS opened the station to viewing parties as well, such that local residents might get the opportunity to see TV for themselves. In a 1951 broadcast, Jones told listeners, quote, most nights KVOS can see up to 820 people in the studio, where they may sit in comfort and see good TV. You can bring your whole family if you like. Many of the TV and U broadcasts were devoted to informing listeners about the possibility of even having a TV station in Bellingham, what kind of programming content they could expect, and questioning whether or not that programming would suit the tastes of KVOS listeners. In a 1951 broadcast, Jones argued, quote, it's the consensus of opinion throughout the television industry that it's impossible for a city of under 200,000 population to support a TV station. We think they're wrong. Those supposedly in the know said our engineers couldn't build our TV cable, which is now in operation and working well, but they did. In another 1951 broadcast, the announcer, not Jones, argued, quote, metropolitan cities the country over have had television for several years now. TV for towns the size of Bellingham, where they were located so far from metropolitan areas, was considered possibly only in the distant future. KVOS, however, didn't want to wait. It was the desire of Rogan Jones, KVOS owner, to bring television to Bellingham as soon as practical and possible. Thus, KVOS rhetorically positioned Bellingham in opposition to larger metropolitan areas, but as a means of arguing why television would further progress Bellingham and bring it into the cosmopolitan future. In keeping with the station's history, TVU noted that the station would prioritize news in a no-frills way, suggesting, quote, we're not going to go through all the trouble and expense of setting up complicated props. We'll just take the camera into the broadcast studio or newsroom and televise the actual broadcasting. Yet Jones had higher hopes as well, namely that TV would enable viewers to travel the world and broaden their horizons right from the comfort of their home. This was a key advertising pitch for TV at the time, where TV was envisioned as a window to the world, enabling viewers to both move and stay put, what cultural theorist Raymond Williams called mobile privatization. In a December 1950 KVOS broadcast, Jones extolled the possibilities of TV as a means of transporting viewers anywhere on the globe, stating, quote, "One can sit at home and see and hear what's going on in the world. Shaking events are brought to the home where Americans may form conclusions in quiet concentration. Even travel has never given the average American the opportunities that TV brings." Vague references during this broadcast were made to, quote, "the pressures and fatigues of our new way of living brought on by the totalitarian efforts to control the world," with the promise that television offered both respite and solution to this totalitarianisms by helping to constitute an educated public that could, indeed, form conclusions in quiet concentration. These references promoted the idea that television could help viewers to make sense of the rise of communism in the USSR, while at the same time, the practice of viewing television was itself envisioned as a duty of good citizenship that confirmed the values of a liberal democratic society through reinforcing the centrality of the home, family, individualism, and private contemplation, not to mention mass consumption. Ultimately, the prevailing issue for whether KVOS could start a TV station or not would be cost. How could they run a station and air enough content in the city where few residents had a set? And even if many more got a set, there was still a large possibility they wouldn't be able to garner enough advertising dollars. In the end, it would be the potential to broadcast signal to reach Canadian audiences in Vancouver and the south suburbs that would make it possible for KVOS to sustain a TV station. Now, there's very little scholarly research on early TV broadcasting in a transnational context. Like radio, early television was largely theorized as a national medium, which, though it could create a window to the world, had been understood as playing a role in constituting mostly a sense of national identity and citizenship. Yet, as Michelle Helms notes, quote, "No previous medium possessed the equally important capacity of radio waves to transgress national borders. This perspective points to the inherent transnationalism of broadcasting's cultural economy, constituted both by the demands of the nation and the equally compelling impulses to go beyond, to provide a conduit to speak to other nations and to let other influences stream into the national space. But there exists, to my understanding, virtually no account of individual stations who actually sought out this transnational potential of television broadcasting from the beginning. But KVOS did. And it's unclear precisely when they realized the possibilities inherent in its geographical location on an international border in terms of what that could mean for television. But as early as 1951, it was clear that KVOS was aware that Canadians would be able to pick up on their signal. Still, initially, Canadians weren't necessarily seen as the primary audience, but instead were seen as an audience the station could capture in order to garner Canadian advertising dollars. But Canadians, upon hearing the potential for a TV station in close proximity, and knowing that the likelihood of a Canadian station was at least a few years off into the future, began to solicit KVOS to see if they would be willing to air Canadian-produced content. In a November 1952 letter from the Dodge Rutherford Dramatic School in Vancouver, BC, the school's business manager inquired about the potential for KVOS to open the station to the school's annual Sun Race show that featured 300 children from all over BC who needed, quote, "an outlet and an opportunity for them to go ahead in their work. In other words," she wrote, "we need you." The station received a number of these requests, all with talent that Canadians wanted to showcase over KVOS TV. But as Jones replied to one such inquirer in a letter dated February 5th, 1953, the station was at the time not planning on using any live production, although he did suggest they would show some films produced in Vancouver or Victoria. The first KVOS TV broadcast was actually a co-production with the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Company, of Queen Elizabeth's coronation on June 2nd, 1953, where KVOS received film from the CBC that was flown from Toronto to Vancouver and driven over the border to the KVOS station in Bellingham by Rogan Jones himself. And it was shortly thereafter that KVOS began to brand itself as the Peace Arch Station, symbolizing peace and friendship and the possibilities of bridging the two distinct audiences the station soon came to serve. This shift in station identity went beyond the logo. It changed the station's orientation in thinking about what it would mean to serve the local public interest, because it changed who got included in the idea of local and public. No longer was the station able to assume a citizen steeped in Bellingham's history and cultural practices, nor even one who subscribed to any broader collective identity at all. Thus, the station would have to work to bridge these two listening audiences, and in so doing, it would have to persuade them to see themselves differently as well, to see themselves as members of a peace arch country. The early television programming of KVOS thus helped to constitute a new sense of local identity, one that was both regional and transnational in nature. The possibility of constituting this sense of cross-border regionalism and transnational identity was further enabled when KVOS built a new antenna at the top of Mount Constitution on Orcas Island to extend their reach into southern British Columbia. In so doing, the station literally helped to remap the region, as shown here in this displayed map. Maps play an important material role in our cognition. They become guideways with which we navigate our physical surroundings, and they help to define for us not only where things are, but also their boundaries. In other words, maps create a sense of inside and outside, that within the map and that on its periphery, beyond the map, or even that which is unknown and unplottable. This KVOS signal map is, for me, a fairly poignant symbol in helping to demonstrate the links between how television affected both the material geography of the region. It literally helped to create a new physical identification of the boundaries of a region, and how this physical and geographical manifestation of television space compressing signals constituted new senses of identity, as those who seemed distant and unknown before were newly close and knowable. In a letter to Raoul Bertrand on February 29, 1956, describing the Peace Arch mission, Jones wrote, "You and I have an interest in helping our audiences learn to know each other around the world. KVOS TV has the added interest in Vancouverites and Canadians increasingly aware of what international friends, contexts, knowledge, and associations might amount to. For as that knowledge goes, so will go KVOS TV." KVOS's desire to create a cross-border identity for the Peace Arch country stands out in television history. In particular, it helps to elucidate some of the ways in which individual stations work to both produce and negotiate viewer identities in the time of spatial, political, and economic shifts taking place in the early 50s, such as suburbanization, the rise of communism, and neo-colonial discourses of development, in which the Pacific Northwest would actually play a particularly significant role as its stake in imperial expansion through international trade with Hong Kong and South Asia, and other South Asian nations would position the region and thus its citizens as key players in ensuring the global flow of capital and free trade in the post-war era. These forces, along with Rogan's and his wife's international travels in the early and mid-1950s to Russia, Europe, and the Middle East, would play a significant role in KVOS's commitment to international programming through a new department of foreign programs as part of its local public service in the latter part of the 1950s. In a letter to Pat Ballargrian in 1957, Rogan wrote, quote, "I came home determined to devote substantially all our public service efforts on KVOS TV to telling our audience about the people, places, and progress of the world. The purposes of these new international programs were described in a circa 1957 memo from Jones as follows, quote, "Believing that foreign policies of Canada and the United States can only be sound, constructive, and consistent, where the sovereign citizens of the two nations are interested and informed about the news of the world, the Department of Foreign Programs proposes to experiment with many formats until it finds useful and interesting ways to tell the Peace Arch country about the people, places, and progress of the world, and tell the world about the proofs and values of peace. Basically, we feel that U.S. foreign policy is poor to bad and won't be what it should be until the sovereign citizens know and care about people around the world. We also feel that TV is perhaps the only instrument to correct this latter condition and that nearly everything else must wait." Rogan thus believed KVOS TV could be a vehicle for bringing about not only a new regional identity rooted in the Peace Arch country, but that identity, this Peace Arch identity, could itself serve as a symbol and vehicle for uniting the world through television. This discourse of the potentials of television to construct these kinds of ties was also an aim of many government leaders who sought to use TV as a propaganda tool against communism. As Michael Curtin notes, quote, "U.S. leaders believed that television's most important potential was its ability to reach past local elites and vie for uncertain loyalties of citizens in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Cold War television offered a way to help geographically disperse peoples to imagine themselves as an extra-local social order. It would assist them in finding their place as citizens of the free world." These aims are evident in KVOS's programming as well. In a 1957 letter, Jones expressed the purpose of international programming as furthering business interests and the spread of free market capital, writing, quote, "Because we believe in the ever-expanding values of freedom and free enterprise, we see a chance for future expansion of mutually profitable trade with Asia and Africa if we can come to know each other better. This includes average citizens." International programming was therefore promoted as a way for average citizens to know each other, thus promoting U.S. and Canadian business interests abroad. As Rogan noted in a 1957 letter to Hoyt Wirtz regarding international programming content, "I have no objection to propaganda." Though it is unclear if all or even most of Jones' proposed international programming ideas ever came to fruition, the program proposals can tell us much about the way in which the station envisioned its role in serving the public interest in ways that inflected the local with the transnational. One program that it is clear KVOS followed through with was the Around the World Press Conference in 1958, a contest amongst high school students in which the winning contestant won an Around the World tour with all expenses paid by KVOS. Out of 6 finalists, Sharon Dryswell from Chilliwack, BC won, and she was flown on a whirlwind tour of Tokyo, Hong Kong, New Delhi, Karachi, Beirut, Rome, Zurich, Frankfurt, Paris, and London, all in 19 days, including travel. Informing Sharon that she was the winner, Rogan Jones expressed the hope that her travels would, quote, help us from now on in awakening the people of this country to their need to be interested in what's going on around the world, the people and places and the progress. We're proud of you and hope this trip will spur you on to continued hard work in assuming your responsibilities in life in the democratic country in which you live. Like the Around the World Press Conference, many of the international programs that were proposed targeted high school and college-age youth, such as the World in the Peace Arch Country, which proposed to air interviews with international students from UBC and UW, the World High School Forum, which would bring top high school students from around the world to Bellingham to discuss and debate issues of the day, and Worldwide Neighbors, in which 26 foreign stations would produce a short film featuring a day in the life of, quote, the people who live in and around the producing station, featuring a student who would then be eligible to win a scholarship for UBC or Western. Another international program, Operation Good Neighbor, proposed to offer person-to-person financial and project assistance between KVOS viewers and local communities abroad. It was proposed that communities of need would produce films to demonstrate how financial assistance could aid these communities in a variety of modernization projects. Describing a potential program idea for a rural Turkish town in a letter to Duncan S. Ballantyne in 1957, Rogan wrote, quote, basic shots for such a film would include photographs of the architecture of village structures before modern measuring and building techniques were introduced. These films would demonstrate the ancient lack of concern with plumb lines, square corners, and windows and doors fitting snugly. All of these would then serve as a departure point for stating the problem of the rural Turkish artisan and the people who would depend upon his crude work. Then on film, you would state your solution to the problem. Your industrial arts instructors teaching the use of the rule, geometric solutions to problems of stress, these films of problems and solution would then form the basis for a specific appeal for money to buy hammers, saws, planes, and chisels. In other words, then, the films would promote the promises of modernized and mechanized industry to what was otherwise seen as a primitive and backward system. A fairly detailed list of potential projects was proposed in 1957 document, but I'm not sure if any of them were ever followed through on. Other proposed international programs included a worldwide newsreel, interviews with foreign-born citizens, college press conferences, and an initiative to enlist foreign citizens in expanding and contributing to Peace Arch Parks, into Peace Arch Park to represent other nations around the world. A particularly ambitious project, of which I'm quite certain was never fulfilled, was a proposal to build TV stations in at least 30 countries around the world. The program would provide for potential television station managers to travel to Bellingham to learn the details of TV station production and management, and then they would be equipped with the starting materials necessary to go home and build their own stations in their own hometowns to serve their own local public interest. Rogan argued the Foreign TV Stations project would serve the KVOS audience's local public interest because it would, quote, teach these people about all the world so that by precept and example, they see the U.S. as the best country and the free enterprise system, source of the station, as the best system. Thus, there was a kind of underlying civilizing mission here as well, in which television would bring distant others into the Western fold. On my read, KVOS's international programming aims were, on the whole, a kind of mixed bag. On the one hand, these programs seemed really forward-thinking, even radical, potentially cultivating an appreciation of cultural diversity and difference and transnationalism. On the other hand, they seem a reactionary and imperialist aim to counter communism by furthering U.S. and Canadian interests, colonial expansion, and corporate reach through discourses of development and modernization that problematized other cultures as backwards and in need of a Western savior. Nevertheless, KVOS's international programming documents give us some sense of how Bellingham viewers were enjoined to understand themselves in relation to the world around them at a key moment in international history. As such, this history helps to give us some idea as to how KVOS helped to shape local values, identities, dispositions, and practices, both in relation to how we understood ourselves as well as those we considered other. From what I presented here, I've come to the conclusion that KVOS was particularly significant in helping Bellingham to make sense of its in-betweenness, or its peripheral geography and status as neither urban nor rural, and consequently has had a significant impact on how Bellinghamsters were invited to understand themselves and their responsibilities as citizens in relation to broader regional, national, and later international spaces and identities. Yet I want to re-emphasize here that such a project is never total nor ever complete. KVOS's international TV programming, like its radio programming, was received by individuals in unique circumstances working to make sense of the changing world around them, and I have no doubt that they interpreted the messages produced by KVOS in often divergent and conflicting ways. What seems particularly remarkable to me about KVOS's international programming, and indeed all of its local programming, is that it gave Bellingham and its extended locale a space from which to represent and form opinions about events, both local and distant, that made a difference in their lives and in their community. As a May 5th, 1950 KVOS radio broadcast about a local controversy surrounding the Puget Sound milk shed told its listeners, quote, "It is hoped that those who have known us since 1929 will have every confidence that this subject will be discussed on KVOS. This radio station never has and never will deny all sides freedom of discussion over the air. Facilities will be made available." And it seems to me that this is something that's missing from the community at present. If we have no real local community media, then what media serve the local public interest? What vehicles and outlets do we have to both broadcast to others that we live in common with who we are and what we stand for, as well as to listen to our neighbors who might feel completely different about the answers to those questions? A recent article in the Bellingham Herald reported that the new local public access station in Bellingham has received only a handful of content submissions. This seems to confirm the concerns of the City Council that there's just not enough local talent in Bellingham to fill the hours allotted to the public access programming. This has a familiar ring to KVOS's early prognostications about local talent as well, and it echoes the sentiments inherent in the discourse of Bellingham's position between rural-urban as the golden mean, the peripheral city that fears that it might just not have enough cultural creativity and uniqueness of its own. But I've lived in Bellingham long enough now to know that this is clearly not the case, as I'm surrounded by incredibly creative, intelligent, and inspiring people on a daily basis. We're told we have YouTube and social media, supposedly panaceas to both actual and virtual communities, and I by no means want to discount the potentials of these media, for they do hold promise, yet they're not enough. As legal scholar Cass Sunstein has argued, the Web 2.0 interactive social media landscape is more likely to produce an echo chamber than a space for political dialogue, debate, and discussion. That is, we seek out those with whom we agree and thus become more sure of our own ideological predispositions rather than challenged by those who question those dispositions. Certainly, KVOS had its own possibilities and limitations, particularly as a corporate and commercially sponsored entity. The kinds of programming it offered and the audiences it imagined as its viewing public limited the ways in which it would define who was included in the local and thus is in whose interest it worked. But it is perhaps from these lessons we might learn how to go about building a local community media system in the future. We might begin to mark out the possibilities for harnessing not only television, but also its convergent media technologies for reinvigorating a media system that works in the local public interest in the present. Thank you. Thanks. Does anybody have any questions? Suzanne.
Awesome job, Helen.
Thank you.
So much for doing that. I thought it was fascinating that Rogan Jones was doing all of that outreach, like to television with you.
Yes.
At the very beginning, and so that seems interesting to me that he at least was recognizing you got to bring people along, you have to help them, and none of that is happening with the current access
Yeah.
opportunities. They're not doing anything outreach like that.
Yeah. No, I think that you're absolutely right. And I mean, to me, those broadcasts are really, I'm more of a television scholar than I am a radio scholar. And it was just like I found those and it became really clear that like television was never set in stone. It was never clear like this is what television is going to be and this is how it's going to operate. But people debated about it and they talked about it and they worked through it. And because of a variety of contingent political decisions that were made, TV and radio both became what they were for particular reasons. But I mean, I think that you're right. I think we stand at this moment in time to think about, okay, we have this opportunity to build this community media system. What do we want it to look like? And it's such a significant time that, I mean, we absolutely need more opportunities for people to come together and talk about what it should look like. So thank you for that. Yeah, thanks.
When the TV started, did the radio stop?
No, the radio
Did they run together for a while?
They did run concurrently, and the KVOS radio became KGMI. I'm forgetting what actual date that was, but actually, Rogan Jones sold the TV station, and I think it was 1962. So he only owned the TV station for a little over about 10 years. But he continued to work at the radio station, which had become KGMI until 1972 when he died.
I think you did mention that.
Yeah.
Actually.
For some time, at the beginning, it was the co-located, and then it moved to a different location.
Do you know
But I don't know exactly
when. When
when.
they moved to Ellis? Do you know?
I do know in my notes, but I don't have it written here when they moved to Ellis Street. Sorry.
Oh, that's fine.
Dates are really not my thing. That's why I do like more cultural history, the like names, the dates.
So what was your impression of Rogan Jones then? What kind of guy was he?
So I feel like it was hard to write this because I felt like I needed to take this sort of like distant, I couldn't be too close, but because I was working so directly with his materials and, things that he had written and his voice, I felt like he was kind of like my grandfather. When I listened to him, his voice sounded so much like my own grandfather's. Who also sort of grew up around the same time, and I think it had a sort of cadence to it, and that I developed this real affinity for him. And I think a lot of his stuff, he was such an idea person. Like, I don't think a lot of his ideas went into fruition, but he just was constantly, people had said this about him, that he was constantly coming in with, new ideas every day, 30 ideas every day, and maybe one of them would happen. And I think that makes him pretty special. And his politics in the city, I think he fought for the New Deal and really fought for KVOS to be a space for political dialogue and discussion, whereas I don't think that the Herald was really open to that, right? The Herald being the only other sort of medium for people to think about, like, what's happening in the community at the time. So, to me, I think that, he was probably had some faults, but I think he was a pretty amazing person, and that we're really lucky to have him. So I think it was over here, and then, yeah.
Is there any photographs available of Rogan Jones and other people that work at the station?
There are photographs available in the archives, and I didn't include them here, but there are some photographs, but I don't have them with me. In some of the selections, yes?
Yeah, the Bellingham Herald fomented the anti-Sikh riots.
Yeah.
So I have two questions.
Mhm.
One is, do you know any of the content of KVOS programming in that period?
KVOS was not on the air until 1929, so it was well after the Sikh riots. But there still was a lot of, anxiety about South Asian immigration in the years following that. Many people can attribute the riots to one of the reasons why the South Asian Exclusion Act was put into practice, that it had a big push on that. So, there still was a lot of discussion. I had trouble going through some of the radio transcripts just because of the way that they're written. It ends in the middle of a sentence, and I don't really know what happens there or what is said. So I wasn't able to go as deep into the transcripts as I wanted. And there was a lot of local politics discussion that I didn't understand, because it was all these names and people and things that were happening that were super local, but not really a lot of discussion about immigration or any of those kinds of identity, racial politics.
And then my second question is about other controversies later on,
Mhm.
whether he's talking about freedom of speech, but
Mhm.
were trade unions
Mhm.
given access to the
Yeah.
area where their discussion of the two sides in labor disputes, which was used
Yeah.
in town in some areas.
Mhm.
And then also, what about in terms of in the 50s, the issues of red-baiting, and how was that reflected?
Yeah, so certainly, especially in terms of unions, the station was pretty pro-union. Now, the Herald at one point called them strike breakers, and they freaked out that they were called strike breakers because they saw themselves as really in support of union. And I don't know exactly whether or not that they said that they brought in people from Seattle and those people were union men, and I don't know what the reality of that is. But the station definitely supported the union movement and had a lot of people, and especially a lot of news about unions and strikes that they supported and sort of gave space for particularly that side of the debate, especially because the Herald was pretty anti-union, although it too kind of tried to paint both sides as well. And then in the 1950s, it seems like from my read of the program and from the programming that was kind of proposed is that I don't know that it was necessarily out and out anti-communistic, but I think that it was pretty along the sort of dominant lines. Although there are some references to Rogan was definitely skeptical of McCarthyism and wanted to sort of ride the line of being able to promote sort of free market capital and the sort of global expansion of trade to stop communism, but at the same time didn't want to support McCarthyism. So I think that there was some of that going on there. And then later in the 1960s, KVOS, not necessarily under Jones's leadership, but when it got sold, aired a lot of public affairs content on the civil rights movement. And there's a number of really phenomenal old videos that remain from the KVOS collection on a variety of civil rights leaders coming into Bellingham and giving talks, and that were aired on KVOS. And so it actually did, I think, provide a space for a number of, both kind of local and national controversies that were happening from at least a diversity of perspectives. Yes, Elizabeth.
I thought you painted a really wonderful picture of sort of the uniqueness of KVOS and I think the driving vision of Rogan Jones there. But I was wondering, did Jones have any contemporaries that sort of spanned that radio television bridge that had similar vision, particularly in a border area? Did he have anyone that he kind of bounced ideas off of, or was he really truly unique, I think, in terms of the breadth of his vision?
I don't actually know the answer to that. I know there's really not a lot talked about in terms of, especially radio and TV scholarship, anybody else that was really doing that kind of transnational cross-border programming push. Now, one of the problems in a lot of radio and TV scholarship is that almost all of the research is done on networks and on big, companies and not on local stations. And part of that reason is because local stations didn't keep records that people could do archival research with. And so the fact that that KVOS did think to archive its records, and that Rogan Jones thought to archive and document such an enormous amount of records is actually is pretty unique especially to a city of Bellingham size. So like most of the research that's done is in Chicago, and the local TV and some local radio stuff that was done there, particularly amongst like African American local radio and TV shows. But other than that, there's really not that much. So I didn't get a sense that Rogan, from the documents, there's not a lot of other radio people that he was like communicating with about those kinds of issues, although I know he was part of a lot of like broadcasters associations, but I don't know that answer, but it's a good one if there are others. I mean, I know I sort of was problematized with this, like I didn't want to paint this great man picture of history, and at the same time, I mean, he really was a pioneer, and he did drive so much of what happened that it was hard not to kind of go there. Yeah.
As you described throughout the New Deal, there was a very clear division of politics in this town. The liberals listened to the radio station, and the conservatives read the Bellingham Herald. Complicated and fomented by the fact that Frank Seabrook ran the Republican Party up his office in addition to the newspaper.
Absolutely. Well, and Rogan ran for office also, and
right.
Yeah.
Rogan ran for office and had his own candidates. What I wonder, and this may be beyond the scope of your study, but I wonder if you got a sense of whether that was atypical of the period with new radio and communities our size, or was that kind of how it worked? Did radio provide an outlet for the other side in other communities, if you know?
I think that it's a little bit beyond the scope, so I don't want to pretend to like really know. But I do think it was typical that radio was initially owned by a lot of newspapers, and that kind of set the stage for at least it's being like sponsored by advertising and some of the program ideas. But I'm not sure if there were other towns that had the same kind of political division. And I would wager to say, based on the FCC licensing case stuff that I had researched, because the FCC took such issue with how the KVOS had created this political discord in the community, that wasn't something that at the FCC was regularly reviewing. And apparently, like, one of the reasons that they took such issue with KVOS was because people had written in about what was happening here to the FCC to try to get the license revoked, although Rogan claimed that it was the Herald that, like, got people to write, that they, like, made their employees write letters. So I don't know if people were really upset, but my sense is from that probably, there wasn't, maybe there wasn't, but I'm not really sure. Yeah.
The more things change, the more things stay the same.
I know, right? Are there any other?
You mentioned those videos. Are they available?
They are available, and some of them are even digitized, and you can watch them right from the library's website, from the Center for Pacific Northwest's website if you go to the KVOS collection, and then others of them are held here. But I think that they're planning to digitize more, yeah. But there's some gems that are already digitized as well, so. All right, well, thank you so much.
I'd like to thank Helen, and I'd like to thank the folks that are here from KVOS who've had some employment relationship with KVOS. It's really a pleasure to see you, and thanks for honoring us with your presence. And I think after the initial discussion, we have no choice but to have this talk on local access public television, do we? So we'll be moving forward with trying to make that happen. So thank you very much.